Hi everyone, this is Ivor and I'm going to do a relatively brief Adapt Your Life session live. So I'm going to talk a little around some stuff I touched on before, Joseph Kraft and hyperinsulinemia and diabetes, how big it is in the world, and then I'll look at the end towards some solutions. So hope you enjoy it. So the first slide I'm going to show is basically Joe Kraft's work with 15,000 people doing insulin assays for 5 hours after taking 75-gram glucose load. And you'll see here that he got, generally speaking, 4 different responses of insulin, and only one of them, the blue line, was eubinsulinemia or non-diabetic. And a huge number of his patients got hyperinsulinemia, shown by the yellow, orange and red responses there in the curves. So he discovered that basically diabetes was much bigger in the population than anyone realized back in the 1970s. It's obviously much worse today. And he discovered that the proper laboratory diagnosis was to do an insulin assay after taking glucose, and that's when the human machine is responding to the glucose and you get the best possible data. Whereas diagnosing diabetes by glucose measures is extremely weak. In fact, 90% of his diabetics with this proper test actually had okay passing fasting glucose tests. So I'm just going to zoom in though on a hack, so you don't need to do a 5-hour test. And here hopefully you'll see the zoomed in window. And at the 2-hour point after drinking the glucose, if you're above 40 on the insulin level, you've got a problem. You're highly likely diabetic. And if you're below 30 at the 2-hour point, you can see the green there, you're highly likely okay. So a very simple test, take 75 grams glucose, 2 hours later get an insulin, below 30 you're all set, right? So that's the fast version. So I'm going to talk now a little more around something else that Joe said. Based on his thousands of autopsies and research, he said that those with cardiovascular disease not identified with diabetes are simply undiagnosed. That's a pretty strong statement. What he's saying is essentially most heart disease or vascular disease is essentially diabetes. And without any diabetes trace in your body, you largely won't get cardiovascular disease. So that's a strong statement. So let's look at a 2015 study and see, are most heart disease victims actually diabetic, as Joe predicted 40 years ago? So here we'll show the Eurospire study, and basically this is from Europe. It's got around 7,000 random cardiovascular patients from the ages of 18 to 80. So it's a perfect sample of all ages, 24 countries in Europe, a lovely sample of all the cardiovascular victims. And they look closely at their blood glucose metrics. And what you'll see is on the very left, a third of the cardiovascular victims were already full-blown diabetics. So they knew those guys are in trouble, so they removed them from the 7,000. And then in the middle chart, you'll see the remaining 4,000 who are supposedly not diabetic, okay? And when they tested them with glucose metrics alone, they discovered that a third were full diabetic, right, of the non-diabetics. Another third were high risk for diabetes, which is diabetic. There's no real question about that. And the other ones seem to be okay based on glucose. But we know that glucose is a very poor measure for diabetes. And if they were tested with a Kraft test, we can guess that quite a few, many of those, would be essentially diabetic also. So I'll just show the overall summary from this perfect sample across all of Europe. And I just have it there in the final pie. I've put the figures back together. And essentially using glucose alone and HbA1c and measures like that, 81% of the cardiovascular victims of all ages were essentially diabetic. And of course the remaining 19%, they didn't do Kraft tests, they didn't do insulin testing. So I guess you could say that Kraft was largely correct and predicted this decades in advance. Most cardiovascular disease victims are indeed diabetic. So I'm going to go on now a little bit to some of the insulin pathways and explain a little bit with a couple more studies around how you get there. So first I'll just show the insulin canonical pathways. On the left you see the MAP kinase pathway. That's one pathway of insulin action. It's very important. And if you become insulin resistant or diabetic to any degree, this pathway on the left, showing in red, continues to respond fully to your insulin, and in fact higher levels of insulin now as you become hyperinsulinemic. So that keeps getting promoted, and that's not a good thing, because it leads to cellular growth and growth of many things beyond good things, like growth of cancers and growth of your arterial wall and adhesion molecules and many other problems. So if you become hyperinsulinemic diabetic, you do drive that first pathway and continue to drive it pretty hard as your insulin gets higher and higher. On the right you'll see the blue pathway. This is the one that becomes resistant. It's the PI3 kinase pathway. And this is unfortunate, because this pathway that becomes resistant is a good pathway for many reasons. And by becoming resistant, it compounds your problem. So the blue is the one that becomes resistant, and that's a major problem with hyperinsulinemia. So we'll go on to a very interesting study of people who had both parents diabetic. Now these guys were around 40 years old, and they took a bunch of them whose both parents were diabetic, but they had good bloods. They were pretty much healthy and no problem at the age of 40 approximately. And they compared them against 40-year-olds who had no family history. And they did genetic testing of that pathway in blue I showed you, the one that tends to become resistant to insulin's action. So let's see, did the people with diabetic parents who were apparently healthy show up with anything different there? And what you'll see basically is they most certainly did show up as different. Even though they had the same blood measures of glucose, HbA1c, and all the normal measures of health and cholesterol were fine for these guys with diabetic parents, they had markedly lower response in this pathway to insulin's action. So they already, through genetic testing, could be shown to be fundamentally very different than the people with no family history. And that's really interesting, because they hadn't yet become in any way, by their blood markers, ill or show any signs of diabetes. But the genetic testing of the pathway showed up that they were inherently heading for the rocks, right? So that's interesting. But let's look at let's look at their Kraft test. So these guys who did this study did actually look at their pulse glucose insulin. They didn't call it a Kraft test, and they just noted that essentially, oh, wrong slide, sorry about this. Okay, we're missing a slide there. But essentially what happened was they looked at a Kraft type test, and they did see that the insulin response to glucose was higher. But what was really interesting, and they didn't realize, was that the people with the diabetic parents in a Kraft test all failed. They were over 40 at the 2-hour point. And the controls with no diabetic parentage all passed. They were below 30. So interestingly, if you put aside all the genetic testing that I mentioned there, right, that was very interesting, a simple Kraft test, a 2-hour insulin, would have told you that the people with the diabetic parents had actually already failed a diabetes test when they were apparently healthy at the age of 40. So the slide I'm going to show now, it's in the wrong order, is just one other brief study where the guys were 26, 27, 28-year-olds, same kind of study. What you'll see here on the top left is that the people with diabetic parents, only in their 20s, had no problem whatsoever in their bloods, their HbA1c, their glucose, their body weight. They were matched to people who had parents with no diabetes, and they all looked healthy from all the tests you'd get in your doctor's office. And you can see here on the graph a Kraft type test for them. The people with non-diabetic parents was really good. Below 30 at 2 hours, looked great. So what do you think these 26-year-olds who were apparently healthy but had diabetic parents, what do you think their Kraft test looked like? Well, couple load of that. So obviously these people at the age of mid-20s, just by virtue of having diabetic parents and everything that goes with that, there's environmental differences and genetic, they already in their mid-20s had explosively failed the best test in the world for diabetes. So it just shows you how early we could be picking up these guys. But no one's measuring insulin, never mind post-glucose insulin, which is an absolute tragedy because we could be catching these guys way early. And a lot of people viewing will have a fair idea what the solutions are. So I'm going to just show now Kraft's, in another study, 2013, an Asian study, how predictive Kraft test results are. And essentially you can see there, this was an 11-year study, and basically they checked all the people for their patterns, essentially Kraft patterns, and you can see at the top that 11 years later, the people who had a good pattern, only 3% became diabetic. Now that's an extremely low level compared to the average population. And even those guys, if they had been checked after 4 or 5 years, would have begun to fail Kraft tests. But it shows you how low it can be if you're a passer. And over on the right, we see the more severe failures with Kraft patterns. Up to a half of them almost became full-blown diagnosed diabetics within 11 years. Okay, so it shows you how massively we could predict who's going to become diabetic by doing a proper test for diabetes early on, using insulin after glucose. Okay, so now I'll finish off with a sequence on the solutions, and I won't go into too much detail here, and many of you will be aware of most of them, if not all of them. But I'll give you my cut and Dr. Jeffrey Gerber's cut. We have a book coming out in early 18, and it will go through a lot of these in more detail. But essentially, there's a human chronic disease spectrum, essentially, which is based on how hyperinsulinemic or how insulin resistant you are. And both of those, hyperinsulin and insulin resistance, are two sides of a coin. So people shouldn't get caught up in the weeds of whether it's the hyperinsulinemia or the insulin resistance that's the problem. Kraft actually said hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, they are not combatants, they are one and the same. So for problem physiologies that have an insulin regulation issue for whatever root cause, the hyperinsulin and insulin resistance need to be seen as a pair, basically, as two sides of a coin. So I'll show now what we call the spectrum, the chronic disease spectrum. And on the bottom left, you've got ancestrally healthy people, you know, with very healthy adipose tissue, insulin sensitive, and they'd have great blood metrics as well because they're truly non-diabetic. They are the opposite of failing a Kraft test. On the top right, we've got wheels off the wagon, full-blown diabetes, right? A complete metabolic mess. And they're the full-blowns. And up on the top right is where you're going to get most of your MIs, your Alzheimer's disease, essentially a form of diabetes. You've got a lot of cancers and higher rates of all chronic diseases. On the bottom left, if you can get there, you've got the ancestral health of all these tribes who seem to live to 100, and everyone scratches their head and wonders what it is. So that's basically the spectrum, and it's very important to say, well, where am I on the spectrum and what is my strategy to get down to the bottom left? There are many different ways you can go about it, different things that can work. So we look now, and one way to find out where you are on the spectrum if you're middle-aged is kind of to look, well, how diseased am I now? Have I been up on the bad end of the spectrum for many years, or have I been down at the bottom and healthy? And the most powerful way to tell if you're a middle-aged person is to get a calcification scan, a CAC score, which is the calcification of your coronary arteries. And that'll tell you basically how insulin resistant you've been over the decades. And you can see here from left to right, there's risk factors like cholesterol or blood pressure. And when you have 0, 1, 2 or 3 or more risk factors, there's certainly an increasing risk of all-cause mortality. And that's what this graph shows, right? The big one, all-cause. But you'll notice that the risk factors, having more of them, while it does predict worse outcomes and higher mortality, going back into the page is whether you have a 0 score in the front, all 4 bars yellow in the front are a 0 calcification score, and at the back is a high score. So you can hopefully see the massively powerful predictive power and the ability to tell you how diseased you are of calcification score, it far outstrips and outweighs any risk factors that you'll look at and wonder, what's going on. So that's the CAC score from the calcification test, and it will pick up middle-aged people with profound disease who need to do major things to prevent MIs in their near future, and it will sort out the diseased from the non-diseased. So that's the best way to know how long you've been on the bad end of the spectrum. But then what do you do to get to the good end of the spectrum? How do you move yourself? And there are blood tests you can use to track your progress, as well as the likes of the scan. So myself and Jeff, really, Dr. Jeff Gerber, Denver's diet doctor, think of 10 levers or 10 key rules, and I'm just showing them here. If you do all these and you do them well, you're not guaranteed success. There are no guarantees with the complexity of a human machine. But if you do these things well, you are very likely going to move yourself well down towards ancestral health. On the top right there are the 3 elimination levers. They're no-brainers. So sugars, refined carbs, vegetable oils, and this kind of junk, you got to eliminate. If you don't eliminate it and you play with it, it's kind of like having a few cigarettes. You're caught up with it. It's going to be hard to keep it at a low level. So that's just a straight elimination, essentially. Then one of the biggest levers of all, as many of us would agree, is a low carb and only unrefined, unprocessed vegetable type carb with fiber and some benefits for gut microbiome, etc., etc. Both ground leafy vegetables, low carb, no refined carb, no rapid flash to glucose carb, healthy fats, again, not piling up on sausages and processed meats would probably not be ideal, especially in America where there's a lot of adulteration of meat products. So ideally healthy levels of maybe lamb, which is now called land salmon. Of course oily fish would be ideal, and all the healthy fats and avocado and coconut oil. We know what the healthy fats are, right? Kind of the Mediterranean type healthy fats. And then high quality protein. So not to go overboard in protein, to be moderate protein, maybe around 0.4, 0.5 grams per pound of lean body mass, and get high quality protein from nutrient dense foods. That's another key thing, is nutrient density. Then we've got fasting, which I believe in hugely, and many will be aware of Jason Fung's fasting book. Huge benefits to fasting. I eat now 2 meals a day and sometimes 1, and I get massive benefits from it. It resets your hormonal system. It's a huge tool for fixing the metabolic dysregulation of previous diabetes or problems. So fasting is huge. Then sun, stress and sleep. So we kind of put those as the 3 S's. And they basically are very important for some people, not so important for others. But to get good access to sun without burning, to get good sleep and to have stress management will contribute a lot to your overall hormonal balance and to where you are on the spectrum. We've got exercise, stress exercise being the best, resistance training, squats, push-ups, all that kind of thing. Intense to failure, till you can't do any more, in a range of exercises a few times a week would add a lot. And then supplements, and magnesium, potassium, salts, very important if you're eating an ancestral low-carb diet to make you feel great, and also to make sure you're never too low on those items. And some other supplements, like for instance, omega-3, though ideally you'd be getting a lot of omega-3, DHA and EPA from, smaller fish and sardines and things like this, and fatty fish in general. So that's kind of what we would say are the main ways to move down the spectrum. I will put up now, just on the top left, there are blood measures which can help you navigate. And you can see there mostly postprandial glucose, cheap glucose meter, check your glucose after each meal or after occasional meals. Find out what foods keep your glucose rising the least after meals. That's a great, cheap, quick indicator. The post-meal or post-glucose insulin measurement, requires an insulin test, so that would be less frequent. And then we've got various hormones that many doctors will include now in the panel, like adiponectin, which you want high, up at 15 or 16 or 17, and leptin, which you want on the low side. And we have a range of other measures there, which you can see. So quite a few blood measures you can use to tell where you are. And of course, the ratios of cholesterol. The triglyceride to HDL ratio, very important. Much more important than the individual, say, LDL values. So I guess I'll wrap up with that, and hopefully I gave you an overview of what's the biggest disease process in the world, causing very arguably most of the chronic disease, and that is insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, diabetic dysfunction. Recent articles have shown in Germany we now have up to 50% of hospital patients are essentially diabetic, pre or full blown, and probably a lot more of them are, but they don't do insulin testing. In Pakistan, only the other day, a report came out that up to 40 million of children under 20 years old are now diabetic, and 26% of the population is full diabetic on a survey they did, a study, and they were expecting not to reach levels even as high as 15% for another 15 years. Now they're already at 26% full-blown, and as you can imagine, 60 or 70% of them are therefore essentially diabetic. It's just the full-blowns have gone over a quarter of the population. So it's massive, it's the elephant in the room. So you have a choice. You can drift with the rest of the population, not follow the rules, up towards metabolic mayhem, up on the top right of our spectrum here, or you can do the 10 rules and maybe some more. Some people would need special interventions, and push yourself down to ancestral health. And essentially it's your choice. Do you want to adapt your life or not? Thank you.